Hi, everybody. If it's lunchtime where you are, happy lunchtime. Welcome to today's ISE webinar. Today is our annual survey launch. So this is the piece of work we do every year, which is really the state of the nation when it comes to what's happening in our recruitment market. You might already have seen that we've had quite a bit of press this morning. I was on the Today programme at the crack of dawn, so I'm going to be ready for an afternoon nap soon. But you will have my full attention for the next hour. And also we've got quite a lot of press out there. I mean, we'll go into a lot of detail on the survey, but it's a real hot topic across all our forums at the moment. That's what's happening in the graduate market, the jobs market, what's happening with students, what's happening with attraction on campus, etc. So we will get into all of that. As with all our webinars, and we are recording this, so you will get a link a little bit later in the day once it's all downloaded, etc. So you can go back and pick up on anything that you may have missed. Also, please share it amongst your colleagues. You know, the more we spread this information, the better, the more informed we are doing our jobs, etc. The survey is available online, so ISE members, log on to the website. You can download a copy of the survey. We'll also send you the slides from today's webinar. We always aim, those of you who know ISE webinars know we aim to make them as interactive as possible. Please do keep populating questions into the questions box. I will be keeping an eye on those. It's Tristram and Holly, who I'm going to introduce in a sec, who are going to go through all the detail, and they'll be ready to answer your questions at the end of it. We've left plenty of time at the end for those questions, so please do pop them in. As I said, I will keep an eye on those and get to as many of those as I can. One request when you're doing questions, I have got a monitor here, but actually if you can keep your questions concise, because when it's a lot of words, actually it gets a little bit tricky to actually sort of follow the questions whilst I'm also, taking part in the conversation. So should we do some introductions first of all? Most of you will know Tristram, but Holly may be new to a number of you. So Holly, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yes, sure. Hi everyone. I am actually on the Civil Service Statistics fast stream, and I'm currently on a 6-month secondment at the Institute of Student Employers. So I've been working with Tristram on the survey.
And this is your first ISE webinar, is that right, Holly?
It is, yes.
Fantastic. Well, welcome. Well, Tristram, shall I hand over you to get started? You can introduce yourself and then get started with the main presentation.
Yes, great. Okay, well, without further ado, we'll get on with it. So we're going to be flipping backwards and forwards between Holly and I. Holly's done the bulk of the analysis, so when we get any really difficult questions, I'll send them her way. But hopefully we should be able to pick up any questions. We'll try and get through what we've got here in well under the hour, so we've got a bit of a chance to pick up on anything specific. But we will obviously also be working with a range of different ISE groups and so on over the next few months, and probably exploring some of this data a bit more. There's a lot of information here, so don't worry if you don't get all of it. Okay, so our surveys are kind of an institution. They've been going for decades now, and this is great because it gives us the opportunity, as you'll see, to do some kind of cross-sectional analysis where we look at different lots, or longitudinal analysis where we look at different issues that we're talking about this year. We look at how they've changed over, in fact, in some cases, decades and so on. So we'll be doing a bit of that. The recruitment survey is really our biggest survey, our most important survey, and it's got a lot of insights into it, both into the sort of broader sense of how the labour market's going for students, but also I think in the practices that employers are using. So this year we ran the survey in September. We had 69 questions and we had responses from 177 employers, so it's a pretty good response. And when we've added all of that up, that covers a total of around 45,000 student hires that we're describing the experience of. We always put our little caveat that I think this is a very good insight. What we're going to tell you is very good if you're looking at similar kinds of employers to those that are in the ISE. Some foolish employers obviously are not members of the ISE, but if they're basically behaving in a similar way to ISE members, so if they're recruiting large numbers of usually young people at the entry level, my guess is that the survey data we've got here is a pretty good indicator of the kind of behaviour they've got. Outside of that, many students will be getting work being self-employed, they'll be working with SMEs and so on. So, and for those kinds of things, I think there's still some insights in here, but that part of the labour market we're not so strong on. But what we've got here is a very good set of insights on how large employers that are recruiting substantial numbers of students, so HE students, apprentices, school students, and so on, how they're behaving. So if we break this down, for our members, there's a very clear preference for graduates, so they're generally recruiting graduates, and the other two big groups of recruitment that they're doing, which also is around university students, is interns, by which we mean students who are perhaps being recruited for usually a vacation period, perhaps just sort of 3 months to undertake a work placement. And then what we call placement students, which tends to be that kind of sandwich year in industry type of model. And so all of that part of our picture is essentially higher education students. But what we have seen in recent years is also this growth of this school and college leaver group of recruits, particularly linked to apprenticeships as well. So that's an important but a smaller chunk of the total hires that these employers who are members of ISE are recruiting. We've then broken it down into a number of different sectors. We won't get really deeply into the sector data here. We might give you a couple of insights from that, but there's a lot more sector information in the report if you want to look at it. We break it down to these different sectors. And as you can see, we've got, some sectors which we've got a lot of members in, some not so many. And we try and kind of bear that in mind as we're analysing the data. So let's start with, as we've sort of identified 5 big trends. So our first trend is that competition for graduate jobs reached a record high this year. So that's, I think, something that's important to think about. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at the number of applications per hire. So for every job, every graduate job, there was about 90 people applying for that. For every placement, it was about 80. Interns, pretty similar. For every school and college leaver position, it was somewhere in the mid-60s, I think. So what we can say from this is that in all of these categories of hire, there are a lot of people applying for each of these jobs. Now, that doesn't mean that there are 89 or 90 disappointed people for every single graduate job that's out there. Obviously, in fact, most of those people will go on and find a job somewhere else. And many will also apply for lots and lots of different schemes and lots of different vacancies. But what we're seeing, and this is something employers are saying, is that the volume of applications has definitely been going up over the last year. And when we looked at that, particularly for graduates, what we can see is that the number of applicants have gone up to the highest level ever for graduates. So we're at 91 this year. And it's tipped up in that sort of direction in the past, but never quite got that high. The same is true really for the school and college leavers. It's not the highest ever, but it's certainly up there. So we're seeing this very sort of large number of applications for each vacancy. We then have broken this down to try and figure out how much employers are spending. We've got quite a lot of information here. We have got a bit of a sector breakdown. I'll just focus on the kind of overview. So the average employer is spending about $5 grand for every person that they recruit. And for every member of recruitment staff they're looking to recruit 29 or so hires. So what we're seeing is a lot of investment in organisations into actually getting the kind of hires that they need. And generally, they're pretty happy. So when we look at the quality, we ask them about the quality. So in general, our employers tell us that the quality of graduates is pretty high. They're pretty much always able to find the quality that they need. There's basically no one saying they can never find the quality that they need or seldom find the quality that they need. So the system is working, although it's quite busy this year. There's a lot of applications, there's a lot of activity going on. Broadly, I think we would say the system seems to be working in that people are finding the jobs that they're finding the talent that they need for the jobs that they're advertising. When we look at school and college leavers, there's a bit of a contrast. School and college leavers, employers are not quite so happy with the quality. They're perhaps not quite as often able to find people they need, but on balance, almost half the time, employers are saying they're almost always able to find the candidates they need, and most of the rest are saying they're often able to find the candidates they need. So again, you know, it's an interesting distinction. The graduate part of the market seems to be working better than the other part, but both working reasonably well. And it's worth just putting this up. So one of the things we ask about is how many people, when you offer a job, how many people actually say yes, and how many people, you know, renege on that job. And so we've got these figures, and what it tells us really is that most of the offers that employers are making, so 91% of the offers to school and college leavers and 83% of the offers to graduates are being accepted. So again, although there is that concern that, well, we've got lots and lots of people applying for the same job, does that mean that they're going to be holding multiple offers and turning employers down? Well, yes, a bit. There is something of that, but it's not a major theme that's coming through in the data this year. We then just looked and give a bit more detail. We can see that the number of reneges actually changes quite a bit when you look at so reneges is when people kind of basically say they're going to accept a job and then later turn you down, sometimes even as late as not turning up on the first day, which is very disruptive for employers and something that I think, you know, we really try and minimize as much as possible. It's obviously fine for students to turn an offer down, but actually to kind of, you know, mess people around is more challenging for employers to manage. So, but what we can see is that is very variable across different sectors. So it's relatively high in the charity and public sector, and pretty much almost non-existent in the legal sector. And so with all of that, you know, there are some challenges in the way the labour market is working. It's not working completely evenly for everyone as well. But broadly, I think we could say, although it's a very busy market, there is a good sense that employers feel they're getting ultimately the talent that they need. So I'll hand over to Holly here to talk about how the market is bouncing back.
Thanks, Tristram. So yes, for this next trend, there is some positive news that it does seem that for all types of, just checking it moved on to the next slide. For all types of hires, they do seem to be bouncing back, however, and not quite yet at what we would consider normal. So this graph here uses 2018-19 as our kind of pre-pandemic benchmark, and then looks at the percentage change since then. So as you can see, school and college leavers, the kind of greeny line, never dropped during COVID. We didn't see that at all. So that has continued to grow, but the other three all decreased in 2019-20, and are starting to come back this year. For graduates, we saw an increase of 9%, interns 23%, and placement students 7%. There are quite a few sectoral differences in this, and all of that extra data is available within the report. But we also asked respondents about their forecasts for next year. So those dotted lines there show that, and we saw that by the end of the next recruitment cycle, we would expect all but placement students to be at or above kind of normal levels. Placement students does seem to be lagging behind a bit, but is on the right track, and hopefully soon after would get back to normal levels as well. Next slide, please. Great. So despite the bouncing back, there are a few areas of concern. So there were a few types of roles that were identified as ones that employers felt would be more difficult to recruit to in the future. These tend to be the sort of technical roles, so IT, analysis, engineering, programming. So yeah, this could slow the kind of bounce back as well. But it is interesting to see that 45% of employers did not feel that there would be any roles that would become more difficult. So we'll have to see what happens there. We also looked into whether any different contextual changes could affect whether employers start to hire more or less students. Mixed responses on this one, but the main takeaways are that employers felt that the economic recession was likely to force them to recruit less students, and technological changes was likely to see them recruit more. All of the other contextual changes, the vast majority of responses were that they expect no change. So we also looked into salary data, and we can see that ISE employers are offering very competitive salaries, which are above the national average, and that's ensuring that they are getting the right candidates and making sure that they also accept the jobs when offered to them. So the average salaries this year for graduates were 30,500, school and college leavers 19,489, and interns and placement students 20,000. We have all sectoral breakdowns for this as well available within the report. And just to say, all three of those are a slight increase from last year. So when we looked into these on sort of a more of a longer time series, we can see that within the last 20 years, there's been a pretty steady but consistent increase in salaries if you're looking at the actual raw figures. But then in this next graph, we index them to the consumer price index. So this is allowing for the inflation rate. And you'll see that the blue and pink line, graduates and interns and placements, becomes a lot flatter. So that shows that they're really just increasing broadly in line with inflation. Whereas for school and college leavers, it's still quite a steep line, so they are increasing at a faster rate than inflation. You can see right at this on the left-hand side of the graph there that before 2008, salaries were increasing pretty fast up until the financial crisis, and then they dropped after 2008 and haven't really recovered since then. They've just remained quite stable. We have seen in recent times a bit of an increase due to the sort of wider labour shortages, but not loads. Thanks, Tristram.
So generally our story is a kind of positive one, and it's one of this idea of sort of bouncing back. Things are getting better, but that doesn't mean nothing has changed. And one of the main places that we have seen changes is in the way that the recruitment process itself is actually organised. So what we've seen is that COVID has really driven employers to adopt a range of virtual recruitment approaches. And so we asked a number of questions which were essentially, have you moved your recruitment strategy online? Yes, pretty much everyone had. Are most of your attraction activities, so the way you actually get the students to apply for you, going out and doing careers fairs, that kind of thing, has that gone online? Yet pretty much most of that has gone online. What about your selection, your assessment centres, your interviews, those kinds of things? How are they able to get? Most of those are online as well. So now this is something where we would have, I think, had a very different picture if we'd looked a few years ago. I think the number of activities that were online. Now, online recruitment's nothing new. There's always been lots of online recruitment, but it's always been balanced by a lot of face-to-face activities. Since the pandemic, we've seen those things really fall away. It's just not been possible. And I think generally employers are not quite ready to shift back to face-to-face kinds of approaches yet. There's still too much uncertainty. So if you think about the practicalities of this, if you're an employer, you set up you decide you're going to do all your assessment centres in the sort of traditional way. You book a hotel, you tell students to come there, and we have a flare-up of the pandemic. Boris Johnson pops up and says, oh, well, we better stay in this time. It's going to be very difficult for you. There's a lot of risk associated with it. So I think at the moment, employers are keeping most of what they're doing online. We then said, well, how do you think this is going to look in 5 years' time? And a lot of them are showing an indication they would like to go back to at least some kind of face-to-face or hybrid approach, but still almost 50% of them are saying, well, probably in 5 years' time, most of it will be virtual. And I think this is where what was initially quite a short-term shift to kind of manage the complexity of the pandemic is potentially hardening into a longer-term approach where people think, well, actually, it's worked okay. We're going to carry on doing most of our recruitment virtually and online. And that seems to be, now that's not where all employers are, but it's certainly where a sizable minority of them are.
So the next trends around home working is becoming more normal in early careers. So obviously after the big mass home working experiment of the lockdowns last year, it seems that quite a few organisations are considering making this move more permanent and giving up or downsizing their office space. We saw that 13% of respondents did not require student hires to live near to where they work, and almost a quarter, 24%, are recruiting students on the basis that they will work from home most of the time. There's definitely sectoral differences in the attitudes towards home working. So the digital and IT sector was the one that reported having the largest proportion of home-based students, 52%, likely because the types of roles in this sector are the ones that are easier to carry out remotely. 20% of employers also envisioned that within the next 5 years, they would continue to increase the amount of early careers staff that would be based at home. We then asked respondents about internships and placements and the delivery of these over the next year. So obviously in 2020-2021, the majority of these were all virtual, so 72% for internships, but we saw for both internships and placements that it seems like next year they'll move from majority virtual to majority hybrid, with still like quite a minority being mainly face-to-face, just 30% for internships. And you can see quite similar data here for placements as well, going from 62% virtual this year to 67% hybrid next year, and only 24% mainly face-to-face. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of continues and whether any of the potential challenges associated with home working for early careers staff, such as sort of reduced productivity, lack of networking opportunities, potential reduced career progression, whether they can be overcome. But also important to note that there's obviously a lot of benefits as well, one in particular being that by candidates not having to live near to where the office is based, you can increase your pool of candidates and more likely to get a diverse workforce.
Great. And our final trend is that diversity matters, but there's more to do. We've spent quite a bit of time in ISE this year thinking about diversity, and we did our Black Careers Matters report, which we released at the beginning of October, which really dug into the issue of diversity in terms of ethnicity, and particularly about the Black student group, Black and Black heritage students. So in this survey, we also wanted to look at some of those issues, and I think broadly what we found is not a surprise because it builds on a lot of the findings that we found in that work that we did on Black heritage students and early career staff. But we want to look at it a little bit more broadly here. So I think the first thing is that the number of organisations with targets for attracting diversity, quite interestingly actually, that there are quite a lot of areas where there aren't very many firms that have got formal targets. So yes, gender, there's lots of organisations that would like to recruit normally more women, and not always. There are many more, as we reported in the report we did a month or so ago, that are now focusing on race and ethnicity, and then on socioeconomic background is a kind of growing issue and growing area of interest. But in terms of formal targets, not that popular. So only about a quarter of employers have formal targets there. If we look at some of the other issues, many of which actually firms have got a legal responsibility to ensure that they're not discriminating on. And this gets into some complicated legal stuff that I'm probably not qualified to comment on, but which gets into the question of like, well, what constitutes discrimination? So if, for example, you have an organisation and it is recruiting nobody from a particular one of these groups that we're looking at, one of these equality strands, does that constitute some kind of discrimination? And is it something that you should think about and do something about? Well, certainly some firms think it is. So we have a number of different equality strands that we look at, but generally most of them, apart from gender, race and ethnicity, and to some extent socioeconomic background, there are not very many firms that are actively targeting. And there's about a third of firms that are saying, no, we don't have targets for particular types of hire. So what are they doing when they're starting? You know, if you set yourself a target, it can be very useful in driving activity. So what kind of activities is it driving? Well, if we look at the attraction space, what we can see is that it's encouraging firms to actively target particular groups. So if you decide that you want to recruit people from a particular background, that you go and you know, produce marketing materials that have you know, that represent those people. You actively seek to use data to try and target where those people are, what might their interests be, and so on. We also see a very popular approaches to change the universities visited. I mean, one of the things that we looked at in the Black Careers Matter reports was the proportion of Black heritage students in different universities, and what we found was that that proportion ranged between, you know, some universities where it was above 50% Black heritage, down to ones where there was essentially nobody from Black heritage background there. So, and this would be certainly true of socioeconomic issues as well, and it would probably, you would probably also find patterning in terms of some of the other diversity issues, particularly things like religion and so on. And so you switch to universities you visit is one of the ways to start to target a different group. We're also seeing people creating tailored marketing materials and methods that are really particularly targeting a particular group, using social media in that kind of way, running outreach events. So there's quite a lot of activities that are going on, and these are pretty popular. There's quite a lot of organisations engaging with all of these things. If we then look at selection, you know, in the sense that the attraction piece is the concern as well, and not enough people from that community or that group believe that they could work for us or are interested in working for us. But the question with selection in a way gets a little bit sharper. Is there anything that we're doing that is actually discriminating or disadvantaging people from a particular background? Well, what do we do about that? Well, the first thing we need to do is some kind of diversity monitoring. We need to know whether people are actually applying, whether they're getting through that process, at what stage they're falling out of the process, and so on. So monitoring is really important, and that's the top strategy that people are using. And related to that is analysing the outcomes of previous campaigns, to try and understand how that's worked in terms of diversity. And then we see some things that are perhaps getting more into how does the process itself work. So training of staff involved in selection and things like unconscious bias training. But also, I think perhaps, you know, one of the things that came out most strongly from the Black Careers Matters report was the idea of engaging more diverse assessor groups. So not just having, you know, the same people assessing, but giving them a bit of training, but actually saying, can we bring in a wider range of experience, a wider range of backgrounds at some point in the assessment process, because different people are likely to notice different strengths in different candidates. And then we get other stuff that's perhaps a little less popular, like, which is more around supporting candidates through coaching, and some things like contextualized screening or selection processes, which are in use by almost a third of firms and so on. You know, various other strategies. It's quite useful, I think, to see what strategies are out there, but also to see how popular they all are. We then asked, well, what do you need to do to improve your diversity over the next 5 years? Which area do you think you really need to focus on? And it's quite interesting here. I will just flick back to the slide before. If we look at here, we remember when we said what have you got targets for, gender comes top, then race, then socioeconomic background. If we say, what do you actually need to do? What do you need to change? Race and ethnicity comes at the top. People, it's very much in organisations' minds. They recognise that they're often not doing well enough there. They've got to do something about it. So people are saying, actually, we need to do more on that. But then actually socioeconomic background and disability appear before gender. And I think, you know, that's probably right. There's probably further to go on those two issues. So I think there are certainly some of our members have got some quite clear ideas about what needs to happen, but it's not always aligning exactly with what their practice is at the moment. And so that's, I think, an area of sort of development for many of our members. So I'll hand back over to Holly to take you home now.
Thanks. Oh, moved quickly on from that one before. But yeah, we just had our contact details up on there. Tristram, could you just move back a sec? There we go. Thank you. Yeah, so our contact details if anyone has any questions after today's webinar. And then on this next slide, we've just got some final thoughts based on the trends that we presented today that you might want to think about. So how you can manage what seems to be a growing level of demand for jobs. Also thinking about how obviously at the moment, yes, recruitment is rising again, but as we all know, the context is unstable. So long-term planning and trying to think about any of the challenges that may crop up is going to be important. In terms of virtual recruitment, for the last couple of years, this has been a necessity, but it's probably a good idea to take the time to consider whether or not this is how you want to continue. Also going to be important to try to address some of those challenges of home working for young and entry-level staff. And finally, on diversity, like Tristram's just been saying, there are a lot of things that a lot of employers are already doing, but then also it seems like there's a lot that still needs to be done in the next 5 years, and what's being done currently might not be sufficient for that. So it might be time to step up efforts on it. And on this next slide, we've just got where to find the full report. So particularly if you want any of those sectoral breakdowns or just any more detail on lots of what we've presented today, it is all in there, and that's available on the ISE website. Yeah, over to you, Stephen.
Great, thanks both for that snapshot into the survey. I mean, it's a long survey, so we could spend you know, a whole afternoon going through all the various bits and pieces in it. So we pulled out the key themes, and I think it'd be great to explore some of those as you put the questions to us. So I've got a few on the website already. But just before we get into those, I wonder if you guys could comment a little bit more. I mean, a lot of the chatter on LinkedIn, in the forums that we have, both with employers and with university, talk about actually the here and now. There seems to be a lot of competition. There's a lot of competition for student attention. There's anxiety around how many students are actually either have the time to turn up to events, are turning up to those events. I've got some employers talking about actually they think candidate quality is dropping this year. But then we have that, and then I mean there is a difference between candidate starts, those people who started this year, and the recruitment phase we're moving into for next year. So I wonder if there's anything either of you wants to add in terms of a bit of colour to that sort of situation at the moment, because it does seem that we're in calling it a free bile environment is probably a little bit too extreme, but there's definitely tension out there, and there definitely are I think both employers and career services, you know, struggling to get that connection right with students and the jobs that are out there.
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing I always say is that, I mean, social data and economic data doesn't normally move really rapidly. So, you know, if employers were recruiting, you know, 100 people 1 year, they're probably not going to recruit 1,000 next year or 1 the next year either. You know, so people tend to shift things quite slowly. Now, the pandemic has put a bit of a light to that. Even if you think in the pandemic, which was pretty big shift and challenge to the market, we actually saw only maybe 12% of a drop within the graduate market. So the overall process is probably not going to change radically. And while sometimes when people are in a sort of, you know, immediate circumstance, you notice that quality is going up or down, or that the applications are going up or down. You know, when we look at that at the end of the year, we often find that that's smoothed out, and it's more about, you know, where you are and your position. What I think is true, and I think is causing a greater level of complexity within the market than we are used to, is that the number of sort of the approach that we were taking, that the whole sort of paradigm of recruitment has really shifted to this online approach. And so we've moved from something which was, you know, primarily face-to-face, supplemented by some online approaches. We've now moved to something which currently is a primarily online recruitment paradigm. And that means that we are having to kind of reinvent how the market works from the ground up. And I think there's still quite a bit of sort of readjustment going on. We're nowhere near equilibrium on what that is going to ultimately look like. And so, you know, probably the old-fashioned careers fair is dead. Is the online careers fair its replacement, or will it be something else? Like, I think the jury's still out. So I think a lot of what people are noticing is really about this big shift in the processes. So that's my kind of take on why I think people are reporting a lot of kind of uncertainty and confusion this year.
Yeah, it does seem to be all those things appear to be a trend. And also, it's very difficult when you're heat of it to actually get the very clear answers. I heard some universities talking about you know, students are being students again. They were in lockdown for the last year, or they're coming onto campus and being freshers, and also they didn't necessarily have those employability exposures in the last year they might have had done in the same way as usual. So maybe we're a bit out of sync between where employers are at in recruitment numbers and candidates. Just to give an idea in context for the employers on the webinar, I was I won't say which university because it's probably confidential data, just shared with me the number of vacancies and opportunities they've got for students yesterday. And this is a university that you would all know and target probably. Had 1,300 vacancies live in October, and had over 500 events that they were talking to students about. And that was both the university's events and employer events and third-party events. So just that level of volume, I think we are seeing a bit of reaction, of course, because students aren't locked in their bedrooms anymore. 12 months ago, we were all everybody was a much more captive audience. So yes, I think there's quite a lot of pressures around that. Should we get into the questions? Because I've got plenty of questions on here, and some of that we've covered a little bit, and some of them will cross over. So I've got quite a specific one first of all from Kathy, and Kathy's talking about STEM grads, on the relative success of STEM grads in achieving a job with that's related to their degree, and also how successful in jobs that may not be relevant to their degree. Now, this isn't really our data, I would say. This is the sort of stuff that graduate outcomes, what the graduates do, guide that prospects put out. We don't collate student data, but from our data, is there anything that we can say around actual, you know, relevance of a STEM qualification to the job that they might get, or vice versa?
I mean, only really that what we know to be the shortage areas that employers are telling us are the shortage areas are probably areas that STEM graduates will do particularly well in. So, you know, I mean, there's the IT side of things and engineering, which, yeah, are more specific, but also just sort of general analytical and numerical roles, which employers always say they want more of. They're recruiting a lot of them. They are struggling to find them. They're worried about whether they're going to get more difficult to find over the next few years. So when we look at all of that, you think, well, actually, STEM graduates should do pretty well. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, if you're a chemistry student, you're going to work as a chemist, but certainly a lot of the skills that you've developed through your degree will be, you know, very likely to be in quite high demand, I would have thought.
Great, thank you very much. Paul, I've read your question, so if you're still listening, but I don't quite understand it about the legal obligation, so I can see the questions. So Paul, repop that question if you don't mind, and I'll put it to Tristram and Holly. A comment stroke question from Jason. So funny enough, Tristram and I were talking about this very first thing this morning. Recent letter to universities from Michelle Donnellan, Universities Minister, if you don't know, talking about lack of on-campus careers fairs, and she was saying, are the governments aware of our valuable insights into recruitment and attraction that we are uncovering? So there may not be, we will make them aware of the specific findings, but is there anything generally that either of you want to add around that policy piece and that engagement with government and the whole sort of, you know, early career student jobs agenda?
I mean, I have not actually heard them talking all that much about this. It doesn't, I mean, the idea that universities are developing huge numbers of skilled people, and also that, as our data shows, there's an awful lot of employers out there who are desperate to recruit graduates and are recruiting them in pretty large numbers. I think, you know, sometimes when ministers are bashing universities, they probably should think about that, because, you know, I don't think what our data doesn't tell us there's a kind of crisis and that universities education is of no use. I mean, quite the opposite. They tell us that employers are still really very keen on graduates. I mean, they're also very interested in other training routes as well, but they remain very keen on graduates. And so I mean, how we get that, you know, how we get those messages fed into Michelle Donnell and Brain, I'm not sure really.
No, we will keep trying. Question from Deirdre talking about our employers experience fatigue in terms of student attendance at events. The feedback on our employer forums is yes. I think that's something we've already been talking about, that that attendance is definitely down on last year for a number of factors, and we'll have to see a bit later in the season if that definitely continues. A question here from Steve about what's happening in terms of regional roles, and actually is there a significant shift of employers, because we hear a lot of media talk around employers are you know, hybrid working. You don't have to you know, you don't have to be based near the office. Are we seeing that in our data? Is there this, you know, we've always talked about London and the southeast being such a magnet. Is there any evidence that there is a significant shift in disconnecting, you know, the job from the location?
Do you want to talk about that, Holly?
Yeah, sure. To an extent, I mean, the levels in London and the southeast have decreased, and it does seem that obviously with home working, people are able to work more in other regions, even if they're based in London. However, we wouldn't say it's anything majorly significant, because it has kind of been up and down a bit over the last few years anyway. Our data in the recruitment survey as well does show slightly higher percentages in the rest of the world and Europe as well, which was mainly based on a couple of employers that had kind of Europe-wide campaigns. So if we adjusted and removed for those, we think our levels in London might increase a bit anyway, and then they'll probably likely be around normal levels. So I think in general, there is a move away from London and the southeast, however, nothing too significant to show. Don't know if you've got any more thoughts on that, Tristram.
That sounds right to me, yeah.
Yeah. It'd be interesting, because of course we didn't really measure the home working piece before the pandemic, because it wasn't a particularly hot topic. So it's something we'll definitely be able to track over the next year or two. Again, I know on some of the employer forums we've picked up, this is more around internships, so employers thinking to summer next year, if offices aren't sort of busy, vibrant places, are they actually going to want their interns in those environments? You know, because if you want interns in your organisation, you want them to have a great experience. So no conclusions yet, but lots of employers thinking and talking about that. Thanks, Paul. You clarified your question. I get it now. I'm getting up to speed. I'm a little bit slow today, I think. So what Paul was talking about was this internal pressure for early talent teams to make efficiencies. You know, employers are under lots of budget pressures at the moment. And we do hear this on the calls we have, but actually, is there anything that talks about within the survey suggests employers are balancing the need to keep their cost base, you know, under control within the immediate recovery, but then also having to need to fill, you know, long-term recruitment strategies, all the diversity goals that we've been talking about?
I think, is it right, Holly, that the actual cost per hire went up a bit this year? People.
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but oh yeah, yes, it is actually. It was 5,325 this year and was 4,794 last year. So yeah, up about £600.
So, but I mean, some of that is probably taking account of, you know, investment in new kind of kit to move stuff online, and also if you're dealing with a larger number of applicants, that's going to take up time and cost resource ultimately. So you know, it wouldn't surprise me if, even though we've detected a little bit of an increase per hire of what employers are spending, that people who are actually running recruitment teams aren't feeling that so much, given all the shifts and changes that they've had to do, and given how many people are applying. But yeah, I mean, these figures are quite difficult, because it's always difficult to be sure about how much different, you know, how different employers are costing these figures. But we also, in the survey, there's also a bit more detail about how those figures break down, so what people are spending that money on. So bulk of it being spent on attraction, then a little bit on selection, not very much on the kind of keeping in touch stuff, but we've got a bit of a breakdown about how that money's spent and how it kind of breaks down between people and resourcing in terms of money. So yeah, if you dig into the report, you'll probably find some stuff that'd be useful for you for that.
Yes, it is worth saying, I repeat that it's a very difficult figure to measure cost per hire, because if you think about the different sizes of organisation, the different sectors, I mean, the legal sector, spend considerably more than other sectors, which can skew the data if we don't account for that. And also, of course, sorry. The one thing I was going to say was some people, of course, recruitment process outsource. What's in your team, what you do internally, makes it a bit tricky. Sorry, go on, Tristram.
One thing that we do give quite a lot in this report is we give both the mean and the median, and so the mean is just the kind of straightforward add all up and divide by the number of firms that have responded. But that can be a bit more sensitive to a small number of firms, as you said, like the legal sector tends to spend a lot more money on this than anybody else does, so they can pull it up a lot. So we also present the median, which is more what the typical firm that's an ISE member is doing, and so pay attention to that as you're reading the thing, because you might find that you're spending a lot less than the average, but when you look at the median, you're a bit closer to where people are.
I mean, my personal view is I think cost per hire is going to have to go up over the next 12 months. I just think we're getting into, as long as the economic recovery continues, pressures on the labour market related to Brexit and other forces. I can't see employers being able to get away without investing properly in this sector if you're gonna get the hires that you need. Question from Rebecca here, talking about actually, do we know whether employers are offering graduates permanent roles in the same way they were, or is there some evidence that they might be switching to offering more temporary based contracts or time limited contracts just because of economic uncertainty? Do we have anything on that?
We didn't ask that question, but one of the reasons we stopped asking that question was because it really wasn't very common for people to be offering, in these kind of jobs, people are generally offering permanent roles, and the only sense in which they're not is sometimes sort of progression is dependent on like completion of qualifications and that kind of thing. And I don't know, Stephen, whether you have on any of the town halls and things, I haven't particularly picked up that people have switched their kind of contractual arrangements at the moment.
No, I haven't either. It's really not something we see, unless it's specific where there's training contracts involved and there's a break between the training contract and a longer term employment contracts that no, the employees that we work with, their graduate early talent apprentice hiring is strategic, so therefore it's not the kind of thing that they might fluctuate numbers depending on what's happening in the economy. That's the hiring point, but not in terms of contract piece. A question here from Chris. So Chris is asking about any information on proportions of graduate roles that are filled by candidates who previously were interns or placement students, had experience of that in particular employer.
Yes, we did ask that. Holly, do you?
Yes, we do. I'm just trying to find a specific number, but 60% of interns and placement students then went off to work for the employer where they interned. So yeah, a pretty high percentage.
Yes, and I think our data historically has shown that if you do an internship, you're more likely to accept the job offer you're made, and you also stay longer actually within that employer. So our data has always supported very much those kind of intern placement roles. Joanna's asked, could you look again at the slides which refers to competition for jobs in terms of application numbers? We will send the slides out, won't we, after this with the we can send it with the email for the recording. So
yeah, I can put it up again though if you want. Let me have a go. See if I can work the machine.
Still got presenter rights from mine. There we go.
Right.
Oh.
Right. Can you see that?
Yeah. That does track recessions, doesn't it? I was looking at the previous high point in 2011, 12, 13. That was the impact of the financial crash, wasn't it?
So it's graduate. This is just graduates, and I think as Stephen says, it does track the recession a bit, but it's also, I mean, it could also be a bit of a change in culture as well, that we've seen a sort of shift towards more people putting in multiple applications. And certainly something that we hear from employers is that they're a bit fed up with the number of people who put in like pretty low quality, hundreds of low quality applications to probably everybody on the ISE membership. That's generally not a good strategy for students. So obviously students are well within their rights to apply for more than one firm, but they shouldn't really be applying for 20 or 30, because their ability to keep the quality of those applications up is probably pretty limited. So picking the things they're interested in and applying for them. But there's clearly some students that are not heeding that message and are applying to a lot of different places. So this was our attempt to show how that kind of tracks out over the last few years.
Is there also a possibility that, I'm looking at the long term, i.e. the last 20 years, that recruitment technology has played a part whereby you apply online now, you haven't got to fill out a paper-based form. I'm old enough to remember those. There's more testing up front, so maybe you do the testing before the main application bit. I wonder if actually that's almost easier to apply means that actually some students are just applying in a more scattergun approach to get through the first stages before really focusing on their application in depth.
Don't have to deal with any carrier pigeon shortages or anything like that anymore, do we? So yeah, no, I think it probably is. I mean, certainly it's a bit of a mix, but some firms have a very simple first stage, don't they? So you basically just have to kind of register an interest and fill in quite a short application form. I mean, others have gone the other way and actually like load everything into their initial application rather than having quite such defined first and second and third stages and so on as people might have used to have done. So, but yeah, I think in general, you can sit at your desk and apply for a job probably a lot easier than when you had to actually send off for an application form and that kind of thing. So yeah, it does seem quite likely that that's a factor.
Yeah, I think it's something that the sector needs to come back to as well, which is this recognition that yes, it's great that students employers are open to a much more diverse range of students applying. It can be easier to apply, but that means actually there's an awful lot more students being rejected now than ever before. So what kind of message does that send to students when we are, yes, we're saying no to thousands and thousands more students than we did in the past. Got a question here from another Rebecca. I'm not sure we've got the answer to this, but it's around Rebecca's concerned that actually the environmental impact, of course, because nobody's been traveling to events, we've not been shipping stands around the country, we've not been having brochures on tables. So of course, there's been a natural decline in those impacts as a result of the pandemic. Any thoughts or comments that we're hearing from employers about their concerns on that sustainability piece and what that might mean going forward?
Well, there is that, are they called I can't remember what they're called, the Sustainable Recruitment Alliance?
Yeah, which we support, the Sustainable Recruitment Alliance, yeah. Which
is essentially a group of mainly of our members who have come together and made that have noticed that fact and some of the things that they're pledging to is sort of reducing the European gonk mountain and all of these kind of freebies that a lot of employers used to give away, which the efficacy of their ability to engage people in the firm is not that high anyway. So yeah, I mean, so there is some interest in this. I mean, what we know is that generally over the pandemic, some of the environmental indicators trended temporarily in a more positive direction. And what we can say is that at the moment, that kind of approach to recruitment that we were very familiar with everybody running up and down the M1, once a week. I mean, that does seem to have dried up. So, I mean, it will have a positive impact. It's probably not a massive one in the grand scheme of things, but I think this is part of the thing about the new paradigm. It's like, well, what is it going to look like? A lot of people are saying they're going to move to hybrid approaches on lots of the things we asked them about. Well, there's lots of different ways to do hybrid. Some of them might be very positive, sort of environmentally and socially and so on, and others may not. So we kind of, I think that's still emerging, really.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I'm slightly suspicious that actually next year may see a return to more campus activity if competition for students' attention remains as intense. Then actually one of the ways around that is to get back in the face-to-face mode, go to where the students are. So I think that's something that's a bit crystal ball land at the moment. We'll have to see where that ends up. Tristram and Holly, thank you very much. Really, thank you very much for a really good, concise presentation of what is a lot of data in the survey, as usual. Thanks for all your hard work, both of you, in pulling all that analysis together. I know it's no mean feat. And thanks to everybody, you know, who submitted their data. We know it takes time to complete these surveys. When, you know, the feedback we get is at the moment that everybody is pretty much maxed out. So thanks to everybody all around for producing, again, some really useful information that tells us where we're at in the market. But also I think highlights the state of flux we're in. I was reflecting on a call the other day that in hindsight, actually, where we were last year, where everybody was in lockdown, we kind of knew where everybody was. And although we had to move very quickly to get everything online, in some ways, maybe that was relatively more straightforward than the situation we find ourselves in now, where there's so much uncertainty about where we'll be over the next couple of months, and that competition and heat really is returning to the market. So that's something we're definitely going to be coming back to over the next few weeks. A couple of things to look out for. We're working on a session actually that should be out in the next couple of weeks, which is actually exploring this in more detail. What is happening on campus now? What are employers and universities doing to actually tackle some of the challenges we're experiencing around attendance at events, etc. The HE conference that we did very successfully online last year. So that is where sector by sector we'll be going into a lot more detail in terms of actually the challenges that our employers are facing and how they're recruiting, who they're recruiting. Lots of stuff about some of the topics we've talked about today. Please have a look out for that and book out for that online. Our D&I conference next week that will also going to be exploring some of the themes we talked about here in a lot more depth. So there's plenty of activities there for you to engage with and to keep your knowledge up to speed in terms of what is happening in this market. And please do use the survey. It is available online. There's lots of information on there. I know back in the days when I was a recruiter, just having that information to inform the business, because I know that some of the challenges you will all have are actually, you know, when business or organization leaders read the press and talk about, you know, lots of students not getting jobs, there's this assumption that actually, you know, it's very easy to do student recruitment, attraction, development, when actually, as we all know, it's a lot more complex than that. And if you've got any specific questions on the survey and the findings or anything we covered today, please do come to Holly, Tristram or myself and we will answer those. We're just about on the hour, so we've kept pretty much to time. As I said at the start, we will. This has been recorded. It will go onto the website. We will be able to give you the slides, but we'll also be able to. You'll be able to go back and visit anything that you wanted to, that you think you might have missed or wanted to recap on the presentation. And as I said before, please do share it. The more people that see this information, the better. And Tristram, can we have a final farewell from you? This might you're leaving, but not leaving the ISE, aren't you? Anybody who's following our staffing moves. So hopefully we'll still be working on a project basis. But Nicola, who's not with us today, is taking over your role. So I think you should say a little final farewell. This is probably the last survey you work on in this level of detail.
Very sadly, I will not be doing any more of the ISE surveys, but yeah, I may still do other things. But yeah, I mean, I've been particularly pleasurable this year working with Holly, who's done a lot of the super fun things like data cleaning and some of the analysis. But it's the ISE research team is in very good hands, and so I'll be really interested to see what everyone does with it all going forward as well. So.
Fantastic, great, and thank you very much again, Holly, for your input as well. Holly, how long are you with us for on secondment? It's into next year, isn't it? Yeah,
till the end of February.
Fantastic. So we'll definitely have to get you on a few more webinars before then. So great. Thank you very much for your input, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day and talk to you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.